Okay, I want to start by asking you guys a question. I'm going to show you three sentences. Now, these three sentences are basically three different attempts to convey the same information. Okay? And the question is, which sentence is the most concise? Which version of this information is the most concise? So just press pause on your computer and read these to yourself and make your decision. Okay. Have you made a decision which of these three sentences is the most concise? If you guessed B, you'd be correct. B would technically be the most concise. So why? Why is B the most concise? And for that matter, why isn't C the most concise? Because C literally is the shortest of the three sentences here. It's only 5 words. Okay? So why don't we call that one the most concise? Well, as you may have already deduced on your own, C might be physically shorter than the other two sentences, but C actually doesn't convey the same idea that A and B convey. Okay. C, in a sense, cuts out too much from sentences A and B, and what we're left with here is maybe part of the same idea, or a version of part of the same idea, but not the same idea that we have in A and B. Okay. And this is just an illustration of the kind of basic principle underlying the lesson that we're going to be going over this week and next week. Okay. We're going to be talking about conciseness. The goal of being concise, at least in our writing, the goal of being concise is not so much brevity, which is the quality of being brief. It's actually clarity, the quality of being clear. Okay, so our goal as writers is to try to be as clear as possible in our writing. And so often that does mean using fewer words, or at least not using more words than is necessary. Because if we use more words than is necessary, we're actually making it harder for our audience to understand our what we're trying to say. Or if we are using more words than necessary, it's probably because we're not using the right words. And if we're not using the right words, then we're not being clear. Okay, so the goal of being concise is not to say as little as possible, but to be as clear as possible. Okay? And this kind of gets at the definition of conciseness. Okay? When it comes to conciseness as a principle of writing, what we mean is using words economically and omitting any words or avoiding any words that don't add value to our message, and that maybe weigh the message down or get in the way of conveying our message clearly. Okay? What conciseness doesn't mean is leaving out important details. Okay, so here's our title slide. I call this Cutting the Clutter, because what we're actually, a lot of the examples we're going to be looking at, the sentences that we're going to be revising, which are some of these sentences I made up, and some I've actually taken directly from student writing, not yours, but previous classes. A lot of these sentences are going to be wordy, and another way of understanding wordiness is clutter. Our sentences are cluttered, and when our sentences are cluttered, what it means typically is that our ideas are cluttered, our minds are cluttered. And you know that if something is cluttered, if your room is cluttered, if a classroom is cluttered, it kind of makes things a little bit more chaotic and confusing. Okay? A space that's free of clutter is a space that's easier to move around in, a space that's easier to navigate, and the same goes with our sentences. If our sentences are free of clutter, they're going to be easier to understand. I'm going to be walking through 7 different, what I call habits of conciseness. You can think of these as just writing strategies or style strategies. 7 of them, and we're going to break this up into 2 parts. So today we're going to be covering the first 4. Okay. Number 1 is something we've learned about already. We spent a couple of weeks on this. So I'm starting with this one so that we can dispense with it quickly, and that is to avoid nominalism. So just as a quick refresher, what's a nominalization? Well, the word itself literally means turning something into a noun. And when we nominalize, we typically start with a verb or an adjective, and we transform that word into a noun. We literally nominalize it. Okay? So we start with the verb analyze, and when we nominalize it, it becomes analysis. The adjective accurate then becomes accuracy. So these words here in red are nominalizations of their words on the left. So this is what we've been practicing for the last couple of weeks, taking these sentences, which are in their own way kind of wordy, using more words than they need to convey their point. But they're also kind of weak sentences because they don't have good verbs. They don't have active verbs. Okay? They lost the active verbs when they turned them into nominalizations. So instead of writing, we made an analysis of the substance, we could more simply say and more clearly say, we analyzed the substance. It's the same exact idea, right? But we get the point across in fewer words, and because of that, it's actually much clearer. There are fewer words to get in the way of our message there. So that is the first principle, and we're going to continue. We're going to see nominalizations in the practice that we do, but I don't want to belabor that. I want to move on to the next one as quickly as possible. Let's just, before we do that, let's practice this together. And this is in your notes, so you can go ahead and fill this in as you go, or kind of wait for me. It's up to you. 5 phrases here, that each of which can be boiled down to one word. So instead of saying so-and-so made an appearance at the party, we could simply say that so-and-so appeared at the party. Yeah. Or instead of writing, I found a solution to that problem we were having, we could say, I solved that problem we were having. We don't have to write that you and I had a disagreement. We could simply write that you and I disagreed. Here's one that I actually find in a lot of student writing, especially personal narrative essays. I participated in a competition for such and such. Right? Participated in a competition. That could be boiled down to the one word, competed. I competed in. Okay? And lastly, instead of saying she came to the conclusion that blah, 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 she simply concluded. Okay. All straightforward. This actually is kind of similar to lesson 4, or I'm sorry, habit number 4, which we'll get at later in this video, which is taking a phrase and reducing it to a single word. So it'll look a little bit familiar later on. Okay, let's practice this in sentence form here. Let's say I give you this sentence. I have a collection of vintage movie posters. What's the nominalization? Can you see it? It's collection. So if you have a collection of something, what do? What's the action? It's collect. I collect vintage movie posters. Okay? My brother and I have arguments about everything. Well, we kind of saw this one earlier, argument. And that's the action. But here it's a noun. It's a nominalization. So what does that become? Argue. My brother and I argue about everything. And that's it. All right. Habit number 2. Delete filler words. Now, let me just say before I go any further with this one, I want to remind you that the habits that we're focusing on right now and the stuff that we looked at for the last couple of weeks, nominalizations, these lessons pertain mostly and primarily to our writing. Okay, I know that you guys are going to use filler words in your day-to-day speech. I do it too. I do it a lot in these videos. I know that you're going to use nominalizations. It happens. And you're going to do a lot of these things I'm telling you not to do in your everyday speech. That's okay. I mean, if you ask me, I think it's okay. What we're talking about here is your writing. Okay, these kinds of things are going to be habits you want to practice in your writing. Okay. So strategy or habit number 2 is delete filler words. A filler word is a word that literally just fills space. It takes up space and doesn't say anything important or value in the sentence. If you take it out, your nothing will change. Okay, that's how empty and meaningless the word is in your statement. So take a look at this sentence here, and do you notice any words that seem like you could take them out and it wouldn't matter? Any words that just kind of seem to be taking up space? I'll show you the first one if you're having trouble. It's basically. The word basically, I don't think I've ever heard it used in a way that that makes it necessary. I'm sure that there's a way to do it, but most of the time when people use this word, whether it's in writing or in speech, it's a filler word. Okay, and I've gotten to the point now where I try to avoid it when I speak, and it's really hard to do because I've become so habituated to using it. But in writing, I try to eliminate it altogether. Right? Basically, do you notice any others that maybe could go? You're probably looking at your list on your notes. That's okay. Particular is another one. Okay. Now, if you're saying something like "I am very particular about," well, then that would be kind of a necessary use. But in this case, particular could probably be cut. Same thing with certain. Okay. Again, if you're saying "I am certain that," then it's necessary, because then you're talking about being sure of something, being positive about something. But if you're just talking, if you're using it in this case, depends on certain factors, you're just using it as a filler word. Okay, so all of these words here that I've underlined, these could be taken out of our sentence, and it would not hurt the sentence. In fact, it would help, because it would eliminate words that are essentially just getting in the way. All right. So here's what we're left with. Productivity depends on factors that involve psychology more than any technology. Now this is much better, but we're not done. There are still words in here that are just taking up space. Do you notice them? You think you see them? Here they are. Factors that involve. Okay. Productivity depends on factors that involve psychology. And then more than any technology. Here's how I know that these words are just taking up space. Look what happens when we remove them. Productivity depends on psychology more than technology. Now you might argue, you could spend some time arguing that, well, if factors that involve psychology isn't necessarily all of psychology or psychology itself. It might not, these might just be things that are kind of related to psychology or have elements of psychology in it, but we can't attribute it to all of psychology. Sure, that's fair. But by and large, the meaning of this sentence is the same as the meaning of this sentence. Okay? If I gave you this sentence, if I gave you this sentence first and then showed you this sentence, you'd probably say, oh, well, they're the same thing. Okay? This gets the same meaning across, and it does it in fewer words. Okay, now, again, I know I told you that the goal of conciseness is not necessarily brevity, it's clarity. But here, if we go back to our original sentence, you can see here that these filler words are not just taking up space, but they're getting in the way. When we add filler words, we are actually making it harder for our readers to understand the point that we're trying to make. Okay? Here's a list, and you have this list already. Some common filler words. This isn't an exhaustive list. There are a lot more than this, but these are probably the most frequent offenders. Okay, let's take this one on together, and you can revise this in your notes as we go. Each individual component must be carefully cleaned and replaced in its particular location. Okay, well, if we compare this to our list, we can see that individual and particular appear in this sentence. Okay, so when we take these out, we're left with this. Each component must be carefully cleaned and replaced in its location. That is so much better. Okay? each individual. Well, individual is actually implied in each, okay, because each means an individual component, okay, and plus component is singular, so each component is enough. We don't need individual there. In its particular location. Okay, well, if it's in its location, that location itself is particular, so again, not necessary, it's just taking up space. So this is better, but it actually could be better than it is. Okay? And that's because it has a phrase here, a prepositional phrase, that is entirely unnecessary. Okay? Now, this isn't technically a filler phrase, it's more of a redundant phrase, and so this is a bit of a preview of the next habit, and that is in its location. Each component must be carefully cleaned and replaced in its location. Here's the thing, guys. If I replace something, right, especially a component, like if there's a component in a machine, and I take it out, I clean it, and I replace it, where am I putting it? I'm putting it right back in its original location, right? That's what it means to replace something. You switch it out with something else, or you clean it, you repair it, you put it back where you got it. So in its location is unnecessary here because that meaning is already implied in the word replaced. So this sentence really would be better off without it. Each component must be carefully cleaned and replaced. Okay, and this brings us to our third habit of conciseness: eliminate redundancies. Do you see the redundancy in this sentence? I like you, she said, smiling happily. Yes, it's happily. Okay. Typically, if somebody is smiling and they're saying something like this, the mood is happy. The mood in which they're saying it is happy. Okay. Now, if we change that adverb to something less obvious, I like you, she said menacingly, right? Well, then that adds something to the phrase "I like you" that is new and interesting. Okay, or let's say it's "I like you," she said, smiling seductively. Okay, so there, seductively isn't implied in smiling. It adds something new to the sentence, so we would want to keep it. But smiling happily is redundant because typically smiles are happy. How about here? It is my personal belief that. Yes, personal belief. Okay, this is a very, very common redundancy, and again, it's one that you're still going to continue to use in your everyday speech, I imagine. But it's one that I expect you guys to start cutting out of your writing. Okay, why is that? Well, a belief that you have is always going to be a personal belief. Okay. Even if it's a belief that, let's say, I believe this is true within my professional career, right? Like it's a belief I have about education. Professionally, I'm an educator, but it's still my belief, so it's personal to me. Okay, so personal belief is almost always redundant. I don't think I've ever heard or read a use of that phrase where the word personal is necessary. Now, there's another problem with this, though. It is, if we take out personal, we're left with, it is my belief that. Well, do you recognize this word? What kind of word is that? Yeah, it's a nominalization. Okay? So there's two things wrong with this sentence starter. One is we've got the redundancy in personal, but two is we have a nominalization. So the best way to say this would be, I believe that. Okay? I believe. It's almost always the best way to say it, too. I don't think there's ever an occasion where it would be better to say, it is my belief. But I could be wrong, so if you can find one, let me know. Okay, here's some common redundancies. I think some of these are common. Some of these are actually really specific, like glare angrily. But, you get some ideas here. Terrible tragedy is one that I tend to hear a lot, and I don't know why. Is there a tragedy that's not terrible? Is there a wonderful tragedy? I mean, if you think a tragedy is wonderful, then I think you have some other issues here. Various different. Okay, I hear this one a lot. I'm sure I've used this with great frequency too in my past. Free gift. You hear this one on like in the media or advertised. Get your free gift. Usually, if somebody's advertising a free gift, there's some strings attached. It's not entirely free. You know what I mean? Or something like this, in a confused state. Okay, he was in a confused state after the accident. Well, a state, like confused implies state, right? If you're confused, you're in a state, and that state is one of confusion, so you could just say they're confused. Okay. Period of time. Period of time could just be period, or at that time. At that period of time. Period or time. You don't need both together. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Let's take a look at this together. I'm going to give you a sec to just read this over, or just pause your computer and read this over and see how many redundancies you can identify. Okay, that would be phrases that could essentially, where you could just cut one of the words out. Okay? All right, go. Okay. How many did you find? How many redundancies did you find? Okay, I'll show you what they are. Okay. First one I found is anticipate in advance. Right. Well, if you anticipate something, you're doing it in advance. It's literally what the word means, right? It's to think about it and expect it before it happens. So you can't anticipate something after the fact. Ante, by the way, means before. So the word advance is almost literally built into the word anticipate. Okay. The next one would be completely revolutionize. This is one that sometimes people miss. What's wrong with this? Well, what's a revolution? If something makes a revolution, it's going completely around. That's what it means to revolve, right? And a revolution in society has to be complete. Otherwise, it's not a revolution, right? You can't have a partial revolution, because then there's not actually any revolution happening. So it's redundant to say that it has completely revolutionized. Another one, obvious one, is past history, of course. All history is past. I think it would be weird if you had future history. Maybe not. If time travel is possible, that could be. But that's an obvious one. The next one would be eventual outcome. Well, all outcomes are eventual. The last one is unexpectedly surprises us. Guys, if it's expected, then it's not a surprise. So in each of these cases, we're going to drop one of these words. So do not try to anticipate those events that will revolutionize society, because history shows, not past history, history shows that it is the outcome of minor events that surprises us more. Okay. Much clearer. And again, the basic principle behind this is the same as the one before, in that those words that we cut out were just getting in the way. They weren't doing anything of value in the sentence, so they don't belong there. Okay, now here is a sentence that comes from a student. This is not a student from your class or your cohort. This was a student from last year. And this is actually a sentence that came out of one of their personal narrative essays. See if you can spot the redundancy. When I was younger, I had a boisterous and loud personality which made it easy for me to make friends. Here it is. Boisterous and loud personality. Now there are kind of two redundancies here. I'll talk about the first one. If you're boisterous or loud, you're describing your personality. So you don't need to say personality. So you just take that out and change the sentence a little bit to make it a little more grammatically correct. When I was younger, I was boisterous and loud, which made it easy for me to make friends. Now, you could go a step further and say, well, if you're boisterous, you are in some way kind of loud, right? It might not be like loud, in terms of the noise level, but you're loud. You have a kind of loud personality, right? Kind of a big personality. So these words you could argue and say that they're kind of the same thing. So I would keep boisterous, because I think it includes loud, but says more than just loud. So you could say, when I was younger, I was boisterous, which made it easy for me to make friends. But there's another problem here, and I just kind of gave it away. We're repeating the word was. And when I was younger, I was boisterous and loud. This is kind of a redundancy in that you've already said when I was younger. Okay? And to say that I was boisterous, it's you don't need to say was again. Okay, so how do we make this sentence? How do we say this without repeating the clause I was and I was? Okay? Well, here is how I would do it. I was boisterous growing up, which made it easy for me to make friends. So I don't need the subordinate clause here when I was younger. I'll just condense that to growing up and say I was boisterous growing up, which made it easy for me to make friends. Okay, here's another sentence. Again, this from a student. This again comes from a student essay from last year. As I spoke, he looked at me, and he had a look of confusion on his face. Okay, where's the redundancy? We'll talk about the repetition. You probably noticed that right away. We'll talk about that in a sec. But where's the redundancy? Do you see it? Here it is. A look of confusion on his face. All right. Why is this redundant? Well, if you look confused, where's that look going to be? It's going to be on your face. There's really no other way, really no other place where that look of confusion is going to be. So you could just say he had a look of confusion. That would be better than saying a look of confusion on his face. Okay? But again, there's another problem here, and that is the repetition of the word look. As he looked at me, he had a look of confusion on his face. So I don't need to say this twice. Okay, I don't need the word look twice. As a reader, I don't want it twice because it's more than enough. And if it's more than enough, then it's too much and it's getting in the way. Okay? So the challenge would be, how do you rewrite the sentence so that you only use the word look once? Here's one way. As I spoke, he looked at me with confusion. Now, if the student stopped here, I'd say, this is worlds better than what you had. Keep it and move on to the next thing. But if the student were inclined to go a little bit further, they might write this. He looked at me quizzically as I spoke. Now, what I like about this is not so much that quizzically is shorter than with confusion, but that quizzically is a kind of, it's a cooler word than confusion. And it implies confusion, but it also shows me the expression better than confusion does. And I can't really explain why it does that, but I can picture a quizzical expression better than I can picture an expression that appears with confusion, if you know what I mean. So if you have words like this at your disposal, then I would say try using them. Okay, but again, this version here is fine, and again, it's worlds better than the original. But this one here is just, it takes it to the next level. Okay, last lesson for today. This one is a bit long though, but it's incredibly important, and that is to replace a phrase with a word. Just as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the epigraph at the beginning of this lesson, why use two words when one word will do? Something to that effect. Okay. All right, let's take a look at an example, and we're going to kind of work through this together. Okay. This will give you a sense of what we're trying to do here. So here is a very long sentence. As you carefully read what you have written to identify wordiness and errors of spelling, punctuation, and so on, the thing to do before anything else is to see whether you could reduce the wordiness of your sentences by eliminating redundant and meaningless words. Okay, now first, I just want to be clear, this is not a run-on sentence. We talked about this when we actually looked at run-on sentences. This is not a run-on sentence. There is actually nothing grammatically wrong with this sentence. Okay, it doesn't break any rules of grammar here. A run-on sentence, again, is a sentence that where you have two independent clauses that are not joined properly, okay, or with the proper punctuation. So this is not a run-on sentence, but it's an incredibly wordy sentence. Okay, it's one of those sentences where as you start to read it, you kind of slowly lose the meaning of the sentence. By the time you get to the end of it, you forgot where it started. Okay, and that is kind of an illustration of why we're talking about this to begin with. Okay, this sentence is not reader friendly at all. Okay, this writer did not care about their reader when they wrote this sentence. So we're going to make this sentence better for the reader. Okay. By the way, we're going to kind of watch the word count on this as we go. So this sentence clocks in at 44 words. Just to kind of put that into perspective, that's about half the length of the 100-word response that I ask you guys to do on Tuesdays, or I have asked you to do on Tuesdays. So this is like almost half a short answer essay prompt right here. So this is an excessively long sentence. Okay, let's take a look at this phrase here that I've highlighted. Carefully read what you have written to identify wordiness and errors of spelling, punctuation, and so on. There is one word in the English language that we could put in the place of this phrase. There's one word, and this is a common word, especially in English classes, okay, or any class where you're writing an essay. This is a common word, and you know it, and it means to carefully read what you've written so that you can find errors and hopefully eliminate those. You're reading to find errors. What is that word? Do you know it? Proofread. If you guessed proofread, good on you. So proofread. So we could take that whole phrase and cut it down to the single word proofread, and look what happens to our word count. We're now at 28 words. So as you proofread, the thing to do before anything else is to see whether you could, blah, blah, blah. Okay. All right, the next phrase here is this. The thing to do before anything else. The thing to do before anything else. Again, there is one word in our language that could replace this whole phrase. If it's the thing that you do before anything else, so before anything else, what is it? It's first. Okay. As you proofread, first see whether you could reduce the wordiness of your sentences. And now we're down to 20 words. Next phrase. See whether you could. Now I would say here we're going to need 2 words. Okay? Not just one word. 2 words that would not just make this shorter, but also make it clearer, because here's the thing. The word see it's not really being used genuinely here, okay? Because this has nothing to do with like visually looking and seeing, okay? To see whether you could. We use this all the time, right? Hey, see whether you could get that document to me by the end of the day. It's really more of a common expression, and it's actually wordy. The phrase that we're looking for here that would be much better and much clearer and more precise would be try. Okay, try to. As you proofread, first, try to reduce the wordiness of your sentences. Okay, now we're down to 18 words. Last one. Oof. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to ask you guys to boil this down to 1 word or 2 words. We're going to probably need a few more than that, but we can certainly make this shorter. Here's a hint. What are we talking about in this lesson? What's the title of the lesson? Or the subtitle of the lesson? Mm-hmm. So when we reduce the wordiness of our sentences by getting rid of redundant and meaningless words, what are we doing to our writing? We're making it more concise. So what we could say here is make your writing more concise. Okay, so that 44-word sentence has now been cut down to 11 words. That's just 25% of the original. Okay, that's what we're left with. But our meaning is actually it hasn't changed at all. In fact, it's gotten more clear because we got a lot of the clutter out of the way. As you proofread, first, try to make your writing more concise. That's actually really good advice, by the way. And if we were in a regular classroom setting with this unit on personal narrative writing, this is what we'd be doing. Before we do any kind of proofreading workshopping, we'd be going through and looking at the sentences to try to make them more concise. But this is what you should do when you proofread and when you workshop and when you edit. Don't just look at commas and spelling and typos and things like that. See if you've, I've used it right there. Try to ensure that your sentences are conveying your ideas as economically as possible. Okay. So here is also where a lot of students start to kind of get nervous, because when you see the word count of this sentence going down by 75%, you're thinking, many of you are thinking, oh man, how am I going to reach the word count on my essays? So let me just take a second and speak to that concern, and I'll say a couple of things here. Number one, I recognize that this lesson, in a lot of ways, is kind of asking you to go back on some things that some habits you may have learned and picked up along the way in your education. Some bad habits, I should say. Okay. And I recognize that can be kind of challenging. All right. Good writing is clear writing, and clear writing is concise writing. Okay, that's the ultimate goal. Now, sometimes we need big words. Sometimes the big words are the better words. So I'm not asking you to simplify or go back to writing at like a grade school level. Okay, I'm simply asking you to think of your readers. And if you can say what you need to say, if you can convey your idea in 11 words, don't use 44 words to do it. Okay? So how do you meet your word count? Well, here's the other thing. You add more ideas. You add more detail. Okay? You expand on your idea by adding maybe more source information, or you add some counter ideas that you could use to develop. So you develop your idea further. You don't just say the same thing you've been saying. Okay, that's what writers do. The last thing I want to say about this is this sentence here that you're seeing that's 11 words long. It's shorter, but it's not simplistic. Okay, some students think that when you use language like this, right, you sound smarter than when you use language like this. Okay, so in other words, some students make the mistake of thinking that using more words, longer phrases, filling up your sentences with these words and phrases makes you appear more intellectual. And my response is that is totally incorrect. It actually has the opposite effect, right? It makes you look less intelligent because it makes you look like you don't know how to convey your idea in the clearest way possible. And also, I think for some people and for a lot of teachers, it suggests to us that you don't have a complete and completely strong grasp on your idea because you don't have the best language to convey it with. Okay? So again, a concise sentence oftentimes makes you sound smarter and appear smarter because it shows that you have control of the idea and you're able to convey that idea in the clearest way possible. Okay? All right. Let's go through a list of phrases here, and I'm going to show you some words that you should use in place of those phrases. Okay? Due to the fact that, I'm sure many of you are probably cringing right now because you've probably written that at least once in the last week. Or the reason for blah, blah, blah. Okay, these are very similar phrases. They're used almost interchangeably, but there's a word that can almost always replace those phrases just as intelligently, and that is because. Okay. Or since or why, depending on the construction, depending on the sentence that they're in. Okay, but I would challenge you to the next time you find yourself writing or starting a sentence with due to the fact that, okay, go back, cut it out, and just replace it with because. All right. Let's take a look at the sentence here real quick. We must explain the reason for the delay in the meeting. Yeah, well, we have the phrase here, the reason for. Okay. So can I just replace it with because? We must explain because the delay in the meeting? That doesn't really make sense. Since the delay in the meeting, we must explain why the delay. That's closer. So this illustrates another good principle here, or kind of another important point, which is that when we switch out one of these words for a phrase or vice versa, we're going to have to change the structure of the sentence just a little bit. Okay. So if I'm going to revise this, I'm going to replace the reason for with why. It's going to look like this. We must explain why the meeting was delayed. Okay. We must explain why the meeting was delayed. And look at something else, guys. What happens when we change that phrase to that one word why? We also end up making the second clause a little more active, because here we were using the delay as a noun, right? As a nominalization. So we took the verb to delay and we used it as a noun, but now we use it as a verb. The meeting was delayed. So we kind of killed two birds there with one stone, so to speak. Okay, so instead of saying despite the fact that, instead of writing despite the fact that, what single word could we use in place? We could say although, or even though, depending on the clause that it starts with. Okay? And again, I would say you could probably do this in almost every instance. I don't think there's really an instance that would ever necessitate using despite the fact that instead of although. Okay? In the event that, sometimes you hear this in airplanes, in the event of a water landing, please use, right? Well, it would just be better to use if, or should. Should the plane land in the ocean? If the plane must land at sea, use your seat cushion as a flotation device. Okay. I must speak to you with regard to that matter that we were talking about before. I must talk to you about, or regarding. Okay. It is crucial that you contact me if you have any questions. It just would be better to write, you should contact me if you have any questions, or you must contact me. This is a good one. This is one that comes up a lot in student writing, even and I think it's also probably a habit that's harder, writing habit that's harder to break. I am able to blah blah blah, or so and so is able to blah blah blah, okay? Or I have the ability to. Okay? This could be boiled down to the word can. Okay? So and so can, or it is possible that. It is possible that there won't be a final in this class. There might not be a final. Okay, or there might. We'll talk about that later. But it is possible that could usually be replaced, almost always be replaced by one of these four words here. Okay. Okay, here's another one. Another one that I see oftentimes in student writing, and even a lot of non-student writing that typically doesn't need to be used. There has been an increase in the number of people who have not done the attendance assignments. I mean, there hasn't, but let's just use it as an example. Or there's been a decrease in the number of students, blah, blah, blah. Okay. What we could use in its place would be one of these. Okay. More students are completing the attendance assignments, or fewer students are completing the attendance assignments, or maybe better or worse depending on the usage, right? There's been an increase in productivity, right? Productivity has improved. Productivity is better. In addition to, this could become, anybody? Yeah, also, or to. In this day and age, gosh, if you're still using this in your writing, please stop, for the love. In this day and age, today, or if you must, these days, prior to the time of, or prior to the time that This just becomes before. Or at the same time that, this could be during, or while, maybe meanwhile. In order to. You may have heard this one before. In order to. Guys, I don't think there's ever a need to use the phrase in order to. This could always just be to. Okay. Last one that we're going to look at before this lesson is over. Let's take a look at this sentence here, and let's make this more concise. In the event that we go out to dinner, if we're ever able to do that again. In the event that we go out to dinner, it is necessary that we first go to the ATM in light of the fact that I am out of cash. Okay, do you see the phrases? There are 3 phrases here that could be boiled down to a single word or 2 words. You see them? Here they are. In the event that, and it is necessary that, and in light of the fact that. Okay. So what would in the event that become? This one is in your list. Yeah, this would become if. Okay, so if we go out to dinner, it is necessary that. This is like it is crucial that. The same thing. Yeah. Must or should. Okay. And lastly, in light of the fact that. This one technically isn't in your list, but it's the exact same thing as the very first one. It's due to the fact that. So it's the same thing. Okay. So this is how we should be writing this sentence. If we go out to dinner, we have to go to the ATM first because I am out of cash. Okay. All right. So last thing I want to say about this. If you think that, or if you had thought that a sentence like this might make you sound smarter or more formal, I hope that this shows you why that's not true. Okay? This sentence sounds needlessly stuffy and needlessly wordy. These phrases, because they don't actually add anything of value, they seem kind of excessive in their formality and in the number of words it takes to convey those ideas. When we simplify those, when we make them more concise, okay, we actually sound smarter because we show our readers that we have the ability to choose the best language and the most economical language to convey our meaning.